And hello, you beautiful souls. Let's talk about something real, something that might sting a little but ultimately sets you free. It's this: the biggest threat to control isn't some grand act of defiance. It's the simple, quiet act of refusing to be owned. Let that sink in for a moment. Ever notice how real change rarely starts with massive movements? It begins with ordinary people just like you and me who decide to rewrite their own scripts. Think about it, history books often skip over the fact that many power structures didn't crumble because of violent uprisings. No, they fell when people stopped playing along. That's the secret they desperately want to keep hidden. Their power relies entirely on your participation. Withdraw that and their illusion of control shatters. They've likely labeled you as the problem, not because you're inherently flawed, but because you've slipped through their fingers. You've refused to let them puppet your words, your choices, your spirit. This defiance frustrates them, leading them to brand you as the enemy. But here's the kicker: they're not really fighting you. They're battling their own fear of losing control. It's almost comical when you step back and observe it. You didn't need to scream or start a war. Simply declining to join their circus sent the ringmasters into a frenzy. Suddenly accusations flew, lies were juggled, and the lions were unleashed. It was as if you were the entire spectacle, but the truth is far simpler. Their stage is empty without your performance, their crown a paper one without your compliance. So today, let's peel back the curtain on this charade and reveal what really happened. They're finally realizing you were never the problem. They just couldn't control you, and once you grasp this difference, you'll never mistake their accusations for the truth again. One, their hatred was never about you. It was about losing their grip. They didn't dislike you because you were difficult. They resented you because they couldn't mold you into the shape they desired. Control is the hidden motive behind most of the tension you've experienced. It wasn't about your character, intentions, or behavior. It was about their power slipping away. And the moment they understood you couldn't be bent, their frustration morphed into hostility. Remember all those times you were called stubborn, rebellious, or hard to love? Those labels weren't accurate. They were emotional weapons aimed at shaming you into submission. You weren't being difficult. You were refusing the role they scripted for you. And the reason it bothered them so much is because deep down they knew you weren't wrong. They just couldn't handle your strength. Control only works when the controlled agree to stay silent. You didn't. You questioned, you made your own decisions, and each time you did, you chipped away at their perceived authority. That's why you became a target. They had to demonize your independence because it exposed their weakness. What they called arrogance was simply your self-respect shining through. What they called disrespect was you setting boundaries. The irony: you weren't even fighting them, you were just being yourself, and that alone shook their foundation. They mistook your existence outside their control as an attack. In their panic, they tried to convince everyone that you were toxic or unstable. But the chaos wasn't within you. It was in their desperation to dominate what they could never own. Eventually, the truth surfaces. People start seeing the pattern, noticing that the issue arises only when someone refuses to bow down. Suddenly, the narrative shifts. You weren't the villain. You were the one brave enough to live freely. And that strength, though it made you a target, is exactly what makes you unforgettable. 2. You threatened the systems they benefited from. Control only works when the status quo is unchallenged. The moment someone refuses to blindly follow the script, the whole operation starts to wobble. That's precisely why you became such a threat. You weren't just another voice in the chorus. You asked questions they didn't want, noticed cracks they hoped no one would see, and refused to pretend their structure was flawless. That made you dangerous to the very systems they were profiting from. The truth is, many people don't actually want peace or fairness. They want comfort within a system that favors them. As long as everyone follows the unspoken rules, don't question authority, don't step out of line, don't think differently, everything looks fine on the surface. But you disrupted that rhythm. By being yourself, thinking freely, and refusing unfair rules, you disrupted their comfort zone. And when someone's comfort depends on control, disruption feels like an earthquake. That's why they treated you like a problem. You weren't causing chaos, you were exposing it. You weren't breaking anything, you were shining a light on what was already broken. But that light forced them to either fix what was wrong or admit they were invested in keeping it wrong. Since admitting the truth would strip them of power, they turned against you instead. What's even more telling is that you never had to make loud declarations to shake them. Your independence was enough. Your unwillingness to fold under pressure was enough. That alone revealed how fragile their entire system was. Real authority doesn't panic when questioned. It answers. Real leadership doesn't crumble when challenged. It grows stronger. The fact that they reacted with rage smear campaigns and manipulation only proved that their power was built on shaky ground. So while they convinced others that you were unstable, the truth was the opposite. You didn't need control to stand. They did. You didn't need people to obey you to feel secure. They did. Your presence revealed what their authority really was. A performance, not power. And the day they realized you weren't going to play along anymore was the day their system lost its disguise. You weren't a threat to peace. You were a threat to control, and that was more than they could handle. 3. They didn't want peace. They wanted submission. They didn't want peace with you. They wanted control of you. That's the part people rarely say out loud. They weren't looking for understanding, balance, or a healthy relationship. What they wanted was submission disguised as peace. They wanted you to smile, nod, and play along while they pulled the strings, and when you didn't, suddenly you became difficult, argumentative, or the problem. Peace has nothing to do with silence. It's built on respect, honesty, and fairness. But controlling people swap peace for dominance. They believe things are only calm when everyone obeys them without resistance. That's why every time you stood your ground, it wasn't received as a normal disagreement. It was treated like war. Your independence wasn't rebellion, but it felt like it to them because the only version of peace they understood was one where you erased yourself to keep them comfortable. What frustrated them most was that you didn't need their approval to breathe. You weren't willing to shrink your opinions or dim your light just to avoid conflict. That scared them because it meant they couldn't dangle harmony over your head as a reward for compliance. The moment they realized you weren't chasing their version of peace, they lost their only weapon against you. This is why they twisted the narrative. They wanted people to believe you were stirring up chaos when in reality you were just refusing to bow. They wanted the story to be that you couldn't get along when the truth was they couldn't function without dominance. And while they were painting you as the problem, what they were really revealing was how little they understood peace in the first place. Over time, the truth comes out. People start noticing that the person who accused you of being difficult always seems to have drama wherever they go. They start to see that you weren't the troublemaker. You were just unwilling to trade your soul for their comfort. That's when it becomes clear you weren't fighting against peace. You were fighting for real peace, the kind that comes from freedom, not control. 4. You became a mirror that terrified them. They didn't despise you for what you did to them. They despised you for what you revealed about them. Every time you walked in your truth, they were confronted with their own lack of it. Your freedom exposed their captivity, your strength, their weakness, and your authenticity. How much of their life was a performance? Here's the uncomfortable truth: they couldn't separate their hatred of you from the self-hatred they carried. To look at you was to face the reflection they worked so hard to avoid. That's why their attacks always felt exaggerated. Their anger wasn't just about you, it was about what you represented. You became evidence that it was possible to live without chains, to choose integrity over control, to live boldly without bowing to fear. If you could do it, what excuse did they have? That silent question haunted them because it exposed their smallness disguised as authority. People who thrive on control can't stand mirrors. They don't want to see the cracks in their power or the emptiness in their confidence. They prefer shadows where their dominance looks convincing, but you stood there as light and the reflection told a different story. Suddenly their authority didn't look like strength, it looked like desperation. Their confidence didn't look like leadership, it looked like insecurity wearing a mask. This is why they fought so hard to distort your image. They needed to convince others that you were dangerous, unstable, or arrogant, because if the reflection was ever seen clearly, their entire facade would collapse. It wasn't you they were trying to destroy. It was the mirror you held up. No matter how much they tried to break it, the reflection remained. Over time, what terrified them most became undeniable. You weren't the problem, you were the proof. Proof that authority without humility is weakness, that control without respect is emptiness, that freedom doesn't need permission to exist. That's why they couldn't stand you. You didn't just walk freely, you reminded them they could have too if only they'd had the courage. 5. Their narrative collapsed when you stopped explaining yourself. For so long, they thrived on your explanations. Every time you tried to prove your innocence, defend your choices, or justify your boundaries, you unknowingly handed them material to twist. They didn't need the truth. They needed fragments of your words to manipulate into their own story. The more you explained, the more they spun it until it looked like you were guilty of things you never did. That was their game: drag you into endless explanations so they could keep control of the narrative. But then something shifted. You stopped defending yourself, you stopped arguing your value, you stopped performing the exhausting task of proving yourself to people who had already decided not to see you. In that moment, everything they built began to collapse because without your words to twist, they had nothing left but their lies. Lies sound a lot less convincing when they stand alone without your energy holding them up. That's the part that made them panic. They expected your silence to make you look weak. They thought your refusal to respond would prove them right, but it backfired. The absence of your defense forced people to question why you weren't scrambling anymore. It made others notice that the only voices screaming were the ones accusing you. Suddenly, the weight of suspicion shifted not toward you, but toward them. What's powerful is that your refusal to explain wasn't just silence. It was strength. It was a quiet statement that your worth wasn't up for debate, your truth wasn't up for trial, and your soul wasn't a courtroom for their insecurities. You didn't need to fight for your place anymore because your existence itself was the proof. In the end, that's what broke their narrative, not a dramatic confrontation, not a long speech, not even revenge, just the calm, steady refusal to keep feeding their lies with your energy. You showed them the truth doesn't need constant defending, but lies do. Once you stepped out of the game, they were left alone with their own false story crumbling under the weight of its emptiness. 6. They mistook your boundaries for rebellion. When someone thrives on control, the word no feels like a personal attack. To them, it isn't just a simple refusal, it's a threat to their authority, a crack in the illusion of dominance they've worked so hard to maintain. That's why your boundaries were never received as healthy or necessary. They twisted them into rebellion as though you were staging a revolt, when in reality you were simply protecting your humanity. You weren't trying to overthrow them. You weren't seeking chaos, and you weren't even being disrespectful. You were doing what every healthy person has the right to do, deciding what you will and will not tolerate. But in their world, respect only had one definition: compliance. If you obeyed, you were good. If you questioned, resisted, or set limits, you were disrespectful. It had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with their need to feel superior. What they failed to see is that boundaries aren't weapons, they're shields. A shield doesn't hurt anyone. It just protects the person holding it. But to someone addicted to control, even your shield feels like a sword. Your refusal to be drained, manipulated, or disrespected was never an act of war, but they treated it as one because it meant they no longer had unlimited access to you. The irony is that the very boundaries they mocked or resented were the same ones that exposed their true intentions. A person who genuinely cares about you will respect your limits even if they don't fully understand them. A person who only wants power over you will fight your boundaries like their life depends on it. Every time they reacted to your no with anger, they revealed that they weren't seeking love, partnership, or mutual respect. They were seeking control. Over time, this is what makes the truth undeniable. You weren't rebellious, you were reasonable. You weren't destructive, you were discerning. You weren't tearing things down. You were preserving your dignity. They called it rebellion because that was the only language they understood. But in reality, your boundaries were the most honest form of self-respect you could have shown. That respect, even when misunderstood, is the very thing that keeps you free. 7. They had to demonize you to justify their control. They couldn't control you outright, so they had to create a story that made it look like control was necessary. That's why they painted you as the villain. It was never about truth. It was always about strategy. If they could convince others that you were unstable, selfish, or dangerous, then suddenly their controlling behavior wouldn't look like oppression. It would look like protection or leadership. The smear campaign wasn't a reaction. It was a weapon. Notice how carefully it was crafted. They exaggerated your flaws, twisted your words, and highlighted your mistakes while conveniently hiding their own. They turned ordinary disagreements into tales of rebellion, and they reframed your independence as arrogance. The goal wasn't to describe you accurately. The goal was to distort you so much that others wouldn't question their authority. If you looked guilty enough, then their control could pass as wisdom. This tactic works because people are quicker to believe a loud lie than a quiet truth, and they knew that. They knew if they shouted their version of events long enough, people would stop asking questions. So they made you the scapegoat. Every problem in the environment, every conflict, every tension, they pinned it on you. That way, nobody had time to ask why the person pointing fingers always seemed to be at the center of the storm. But here's what they underestimated: lies may run fast, but they can't outrun time. Eventually, people start noticing patterns. They see that your so-called chaos disappears when you're absent, while the one who labeled you as a villain keeps stirring trouble wherever they go. They realize the demonization was never about you. It was a disguise for their own dysfunction. The most powerful part of this exposure is that you didn't need to fight for it. You didn't have to defend yourself endlessly or chase after their accusations. The truth simply began to reveal itself because reality has a way of cutting through performance. In the end, their attempt to demonize you didn't strip away your value. It stripped away their credibility. They wanted to make you look like the villain so no one would see their oppression, but now everyone sees the truth. The villain was the one holding the chains. 8. Your independence made their influence irrelevant. What shook them the most wasn't your defiance, it was your independence. You weren't waiting on their approval. You weren't desperate for their resources, and you weren't clinging to their validation. That made you untouchable in ways they couldn't tolerate, because control thrives on dependency. When someone needs you for money, status, connections, or acceptance, you can dictate their choices. But when that dependency is gone, control dies on the spot. That's exactly what your life revealed to them. They couldn't buy your loyalty with small favors because you weren't starving for crumbs. They couldn't threaten you with rejection because you were already at peace with standing alone. They couldn't lure you back with guilt because you knew the difference between genuine care and emotional blackmail. Every tactic that worked on others slid off you. That's when they realized you were the one person they couldn't own. Independence doesn't just frustrate controllers, it exposes them. When their influence stops working on you, it becomes clear that the power they claimed to have was never real authority. It was manipulation dressed up as leadership. They weren't guiding anyone. They were baiting, bribing, and intimidating. You blew that cover simply by being whole without them. This is why your freedom felt like betrayal to them. In their mind, loyalty meant dependence. If you weren't leaning on them, you must have been turning against them, but that was never the case. You simply chose to live grounded in your own strength. You weren't rejecting connection. You were rejecting control. They didn't know how to function in a relationship that wasn't built on leverage. The irony is what they feared most is what made you unshakable. Your independence freed you from their manipulation, but it also freed you from constant fear. You didn't have to wonder if they'd pull the rug from under you because your stability wasn't tied to their hands. That's what makes independence so powerful. It doesn't just weaken their control, it strengthens your peace. In the end, your self-sustaining spirit revealed the truth they tried to hide. Their influence only mattered when someone needed it. You didn't. In that moment, all their strategies, threats, and bribes became useless. Your independence wasn't rebellion, it was liberation, and liberation is something they could never contain. 9. They realized power over you was borrowed, not earned. The control they once held over you was never real. It was borrowed. It only existed because you hadn't yet discovered how much strength you carried. Maybe you were conditioned to believe you needed their approval, or you hadn't realized how much freedom you truly had. For a while, that gave them leverage. They mistook your silence for weakness, your patience for permission, and your loyalty for submission. But none of it was earned. It was only possible because you hadn't fully stepped into yourself, and that's the thing about borrowed power, it has an expiration date. The moment you woke up to who you were, the clock ran out. They couldn't intimidate you with the same tactics anymore. They couldn't guilt trip you into compliance. They couldn't use fear, shame, or rejection as weapons because you had stopped seeing them as authorities and started seeing them as manipulators. What they once framed as dominance was suddenly exposed for what it really was: desperation dressed as control. When power isn't earned, it can't last. Earned power comes with respect. It's rooted in wisdom, trust, and real influence. Borrowed power, on the other hand, depends on illusions and blind spots. It requires the other person to stay unaware of their own worth. That's why your awakening was such a threat. By reclaiming your strength, you cut off the very supply that gave them influence. When the source dries up, the system collapses. The irony is they never actually had the kind of power they thought they did. They weren't strong leaders, they were opportunists taking advantage of your unawareness. The day you stopped handing them access to your emotions, your choices, and your energy was the day their throne turned into an empty chair. That's why they fought so hard to pull you back under. It wasn't love they were losing, it was leverage. In the end, the truth became undeniable. Their control was never real authority, only borrowed access. Once you reclaimed what was always yours, they were left exposed. No strategies left, no cards to play, no grip to hold, just the hollow sound of desperation trying to imitate power. From that point on, the only person with real authority over your life was you. 10. Their control collapsed when you refused to perform. For as long as you stayed in the role they assigned you, their script worked perfectly. You were the scapegoat when they needed blame, the pleaser when they needed comfort, the silent one when they needed control, and the sacrifice when they needed someone to carry the weight of their dysfunction. It wasn't because you were weak, it was because you were conditioned to believe that playing those roles kept the peace. Eventually, you realized peace built on performance isn't peace at all. The moment you refused to perform, their whole system began to unravel. Controllers rely on an audience to believe their act. They need you to play along so their narrative looks convincing. Without your participation, their story starts to look strange. Who do they scapegoat when you refuse to carry false blame? Who do they silence when you find your voice? Who do they exploit when you no longer volunteer yourself as a sacrifice? The answer is no one. Suddenly, the play they've been directing turns into an empty stage with no actors left to prop it up. That's why they fought so hard to drag you back into character. Your absence didn't just expose the truth to others, it exposed the truth to themselves. They weren't leaders. They were manipulators. They weren't protectors. They were exploiters. They weren't victims of your so-called rebellion. They were dependent on your compliance to keep their facade alive. The second you stopped playing your part, their entire production looked cheap and transparent. Here's the most powerful part: you didn't have to destroy them. You didn't need revenge schemes or retaliation. All it took was walking off their stage and reclaiming your own script. By stepping away, you forced them to face a reality they could no longer dress up with lies. That without someone to control, they had nothing. Their power didn't collapse because you fought harder. It collapsed because you stopped performing altogether. In the end, your refusal became the loudest truth. You showed that their influence wasn't real power. It was theater. When you chose authenticity over acting, the curtain fell, the lights dimmed, and their performance was revealed for what it always was: a fraud built on borrowed roles you no longer agreed to play. 11. They hated you for choosing truth over belonging. Most people are willing to trade a little bit of themselves to belong. They'll stay quiet when something feels wrong. They'll bend their values to avoid conflict, and they'll go along with lies just to keep a seat at the table. But you refused. You chose truth over belonging, and that's why they hated you. You wouldn't shrink yourself to make others comfortable, and you wouldn't pretend to be someone you weren't just to fit into their mold. That integrity made you untouchable, but it also made you a threat to anyone who built their comfort on conformity. They couldn't understand why you wouldn't play along. To them, belonging was the highest prize, even if it meant living a lie. But to you, belonging without truth wasn't belonging at all. It was imprisonment dressed up as acceptance. That's what made you different. You weren't afraid to lose a crowd if it meant keeping your soul intact. When they realized they couldn't twist you into their version of acceptable, they labeled you as the outcast, not because you were broken, but because you refused to break. The irony is they were never rejecting you for who you truly were. They were rejecting the mirror you held up. Your choice exposed their compromise. Your honesty reminded them of the lies they told themselves to survive. Instead of rising to that same level of truth, they tried to push you out so they wouldn't have to face what they lacked. They mistook your courage as arrogance when in reality it was the very thing they wished they had but didn't dare to embrace. In time, the label of outcast becomes proof of freedom. You didn't belong to their crowd because you weren't meant to be caged by their conditions. They wanted you smaller, quieter, more agreeable, but you chose to stand whole even if it cost you approval. That choice made you free in a way they could never be while chained to acceptance. That's why their hatred ran so deep. You didn't just reject their mold, you exposed the emptiness of it. You showed that truth is worth more than belonging, that integrity is worth more than approval, and that freedom is worth more than their acceptance. They lost nothing by rejecting you, but you lost nothing by refusing to betray yourself. In fact, you gained the one thing they'll never have the ability to live fully free without permission. 12. They didn't lose control of you, they lost control of the story. From the beginning, their greatest weapon wasn't power over you. It was power over the story. They knew if they could control how others saw you, they wouldn't need to control you directly. That's why they twisted your image, exaggerated your flaws, and spun lies that painted you as unstable, ungrateful, or impossible to deal with. As long as people believed their version, they could keep their reputation intact and their grip unchallenged. But the truth has a way of outliving lies, and that's where their downfall began. At first, it seemed like their smear campaigns were working. They shouted their narrative loud enough that some people believed it. But the longer the story went on, the less it added up. People started noticing that the problem wasn't behaving like a problem. You weren't out there causing chaos. You were living your life standing strong, minding your business. Meanwhile, the very ones who called you unstable couldn't keep their own stories straight. The cracks in their lies grew too obvious to ignore. That's when fear set in. Not fear of you as a person, but fear of what would happen if people started asking the right questions. If the spotlight ever shifted, it would reveal that the problem was never you. It was the manipulations, the fabrications, and the desperate attempts to keep control through deceit. Their entire power relied on keeping the illusion alive. Once the illusion started to fade, their authority started to crumble. Here's the part that stung them the most: you didn't have to fight to expose them. You didn't need to campaign for your innocence or wage war to clear your name. All you had to do was live in truth long enough for the lies to collapse under their own weight. Reality always outlasts fabrication. Eventually, people saw the difference between your steady consistency and their constant drama. They thought they had you cornered by controlling the story, but in the end, they only revealed how terrified they were of being exposed. You weren't the danger to their world. The truth was. Once the truth grew louder than their noise, their control was gone, not because you lost the battle, but because the story they built couldn't survive reality. 13. You proved that love without freedom isn't love. What they offered you was never love. It was possession disguised as care. They wanted the benefits of your loyalty without giving you the respect that loyalty requires. They wanted closeness, but only on their terms, where your needs didn't matter and your voice didn't count. They wanted obedience, but stripped of choice, as though your individuality was something to be erased for the sake of their comfort. That wasn't love. It was captivity dressed up as connection. The moment you realized it, the illusion shattered. Love without freedom is nothing more than a contract of control. If you can't say no without punishment, then your yes doesn't mean anything. If you can't express your truth without fear of backlash, then your silence isn't peace. It's suffocation. What they wanted wasn't partnership, it was ownership. They wanted you close enough to feed their ego, but not free enough to challenge their authority. That arrangement might look like love from the outside, but inside it feels like a cage. The power of your decision was in recognizing that captivity and refusing to call it love anymore. Walking away wasn't just leaving them, it was reclaiming your definition of love. You proved that real love cannot exist where freedom is denied, because love that demands silence isn't love. Love that demands obedience without respect isn't love. Love that punishes independence isn't love. Real love celebrates freedom, it doesn't fear it. That's why your choice hit them so hard. As long as you stayed, they could keep pretending their control was affection. They could convince themselves and others that you were loved because you were near. When you left, the mask fell. Suddenly the truth was undeniable. If what they offered had been real love, it would have made you freer, not smaller. Instead, it was dependency, manipulation, and fear all wrapped up in the word love. In the end, your strength proved what they tried to hide, that their version of love wasn't love at all. You exposed the counterfeit by choosing truth over captivity. Though it broke their illusion, it built your freedom because you refused to confuse chains for commitment, and you refused to trade your humanity for their control. That refusal is what makes your love the love you give and the love you now accept, something they could never replicate. 14 in the end. They saw you were the constant, and they were the chaos. The truth cut through all the noise. They weren't battling your flaws, they were battling their own chaos. You were steady even when storms surrounded you. You were consistent even when they tried to provoke you into reactions that weren't in your nature. They wanted you to crack, to explode, to fall apart so they could point and say, "See, you're the problem." No matter how much pressure they applied, you didn't fold into their script. You stayed rooted, and that's what exposed them. Control thrives when the target is unstable. If you had been impulsive, reckless, or constantly shifting, they would have used that as proof to tighten their grip. Your clarity made their schemes look messy. Your strength made their games look weak. Your stability left no place for their lies to land. That's when the cracks in their performance started to show. They weren't managing you. They were struggling to keep their own dysfunction hidden. This is why they had to flip the narrative. They called you dramatic because you wouldn't be silent. They called you unstable because you refused to be manipulated. They called you cold because you wouldn't bow down to emotional blackmail. Over time, the pattern became too obvious. The so-called chaos was always coming from them. The lies, the outbursts, the control tactics, the endless shifting of rules. It all came from their desperation to rule over something they could never truly create: your peace. Here's the irony: they thought your steadiness was weakness. They thought your calm meant they had power over you, but that calm was the very thing that dismantled them. They realized that you weren't the one spiraling. You were the one observing. You weren't the one flailing. You were the one enduring. They were chaos wearing the mask of authority, and you were the constant that stripped the mask off. By the time the truth was undeniable, their accusations couldn't hold up anymore. Everyone could see the contrast. You weren't the storm, they were. You weren't the confusion, they were. Your presence became proof of their instability. That's the part they'll never forgive. That without lifting a hand, without matching their chaos, you revealed who was truly out of control. Control was never the real issue. You were never hard to love, never impossible to understand, never the villain in their story. The problem was that you couldn't be contained, and that truth unraveled every lie they built around you. They mistook your boundaries for rebellion, your independence for arrogance, your steadiness for coldness, but time has proven otherwise. You weren't unstable, you were the constant. You weren't disloyal, you were simply unwilling to call captivity love. You weren't the problem, you were the proof that their control was always borrowed, never earned. Now their narrative lies in ruins. What they demonized in you was what they secretly lacked: courage, integrity, and freedom. What they painted as rebellion was simply your refusal to abandon yourself. What they called chaos was their own dysfunction mirrored back at them. In the end, it wasn't your voice that exposed them, but your refusal to perform in their play any longer. So let this be clear. You don't need to apologize for being uncontrollable. You don't need to shrink yourself to make others feel powerful. You don't need to trade your freedom for acceptance. The very fact that they had to twist, accuse, and manipulate proves that your strength shook them more than compliance ever could. The truth is undeniable now. They finally see you weren't the problem. You were the one who stood tall while everything around you shook. You were the mirror, the constant, the force they couldn't tame. That more than anything is your victory. If this message resonates, share it. Someone out there is wrestling with the same battles and needs to hear this truth right now. Your support helps this message reach further, touch more lives, and continue to expose the lies that try to keep people bound. Stay connected, stay growing, and let's keep shining light where others try to cast shadows. Keep being the proof. You are amazing, 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 amazing.